Hello and welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition podcast. My name is Torwen and I'm here with my co-host Aidan, and today we're going to be discussing the role of nutrition for focus and productivity. Now, the biggest problems that we see people face are people coming in who talk about having brain fog, hitting that mid-afternoon slump, being unable to focus or getting quite easily distracted, having low motivation, and then also just generally low energy.
So we're going to be talking about some of the things you can do from a nutrition perspective that can help kind of solve or aid in helping those kind of problems. And we're going to start with some theoretical type of background information and then go a bit more practical with it.
Yeah, so the obvious place to start for me is the brain. We know that the brain consumes a massive amount of energy in comparison to the rest of the body. It uses around 20% of the body's daily energy, despite only being about 2% of your body mass. So it is a pretty energetically costly organ. So that means that things like learning, working, and memory formation all do incur pretty significant energy costs. So we have to make sure that the brain has enough fuel.
Yeah, and we wouldn't go and freak out about that too much in terms of if you did like a small to moderate calorie deficit, it's not like your brain just stops functioning or anything like that. But if you were on low calories for an extended period of time, it is obviously going to play a bit of a role there too.
Yeah, so we know that the brain relies on glucose as its main source of energy for things like firing of neurotransmitters, generation of ATP, cellular maintenance, and all of those things. So if we consider glucose as its preferred fuel, yes, we can use ketones in fasting or very low carb states, but we know that, as I said, glucose is what it prefers. So we are then largely talking about carbohydrate as the food group there.
And adding some numbers onto that, so with the whole 20% of people's resting energy expenditure, that comes out as around, on average, 100 to 120 grams of carbs per day. Obviously, there is, or of glucose per day, sorry. Obviously, there's heaps of variation there based on size, based on energy requirements and everything like that. During like fasting and low carb states, this can change a bit where ketones can cover enough to the point that it requires only a glucose amount of about 40 grams per day. And that doesn't all need to technically come from carbohydrates because protein can convert to glucose as well. But those are some numbers that I think are interesting as well.
Yeah, so if we chat then about what that means in terms of stable blood glucose levels and whether that's something that we need to consider. We know in general, stable, steady fuel helps to support that mental energy, stamina, whereas that swing in blood sugar may cause dips in focus, mood, and energy as well. So if we have a look at a few studies then, a meta-analysis that looked at the impact of glycemic load on cognitive performance had a look at lower GI breakfasts and their impact on memory. And it was seen that lower GI breakfasts generally benefited episodic memory around that 2 hours later. But this benefit was the biggest in younger adults, who were younger than 35.
Yeah, we've got the same study there. So like, as we've mentioned, we prepped separately for this and like, yeah, I've got that as well. So like the low GI one, because I was interested in that as well. Like one of my big things that I've wondered for a long time is how much does like stable blood glucose levels matter? And where I think this becomes more interesting for me is I work with a lot of athletes who have pretty high carb needs and also want to work a day job or like have some other goals in life that they're trying to achieve. And we also have extremes the other direction of people on, say, lower carb diets who theoretically would have more stable blood glucose levels, although we've also just spoke about the glucose requirements of the brain, stuff like that. And I think the first thing that makes it interesting to me from a research perspective is that study looking at high GI versus low GI. Does this matter? And it seemed to be like slight favorable benefits for the low GI one in that particular example.
Yeah, and something specific that came out of that study as well was that for those who were aged 5 to 17 years, this lower GI breakfast also supported better attention, which I think is a fairly practical recommendation that we can make, especially if that age group is going to school. And ideally, as a teacher, you'd want kids to have better attention. So that's definitely something to consider there as well.
And then, because obviously that research is just looking low GI versus high GI on like a carbohydrate matched one, the next place I do want to look at is just low carb stuff because I do think it's interesting. And anecdotally, we do find a lot of people on low carb diets reporting heaps of like mental clarity and more productivity and things like that. Anecdotally, I think there's so much there that's like I absolutely would not ignore that. The next step is obviously looking at what does research find? Like if we have like randomized control trials and everything like that, like what does that show? And I do think one thing that's a little bit overlooked in this with the anecdotal stuff is I think anecdotally for every person you find who has a huge increase in like mental clarity, performance and everything like that, you also find someone else who's like, oh, I was just drained the whole time. I was pretty fatigued. I just didn't feel motivated as well. And what research has found is that, looking at it more broadly, often there's impairments in performance in the first few weeks on average, obviously individual variation there. But as people get a bit more adapted to that, they find no major difference, which is cool because it also means you can do what you like if there's no major difference too.
Yeah, and I guess that relates to then that period of time that it takes for plasma ketone bodies to rise as that alternative fuel for the brain to be able to use.
Yeah. Anything more we want to cover on the blood glucose levels?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. So like I don't think that this is like a massive one, but I do think you absolutely want to avoid huge swings. Like you don't want big spikes and crashes, and you definitely don't want to go hypo either. Like obviously that's going to be an issue as well.
Makes sense, yeah.
Let's shift to talking about nutrients for focus. So there's a few we're going to cover. I'm going to start with omega-3s. So going straight to a systematic review, there was a systematic review that found ingestion of omega-3 fatty acids increases learning, memory, cognitive well-being, and blood flow to the brain. That's cool. Like, I think that's a good starting point. I think with everything omega-3 related, it depends heaps on your starting baseline levels. Like if somebody's having heaps of omega-3 already at the baseline, adding omega-3 supplementation is probably not going to help. If somebody doesn't have fish basically ever and isn't doing anything specific to get omega-3s in, they probably get noticeably more benefit than the average person out of this.
And giving a little bit of background context there, we know that omega-3s are something that you have to get through the diet. There are three main ones that we call EPA, DHA, and ALA. And we know that for the brain specifically, DHA is the one that impacts the neurotransmitters and the functions of the brain. So this is why it's important also to have a look at the different kind of supplements that you are using, or making sure that, yes, you can get omega-3s through plant-based foods. The ability for your body to then be able to transfer that to a usable form like DHA is not optimal. So considering, supplementation, if, like you said, if you don't consume much fish at all.
If you were recommending this to a client specifically for this purpose, what would you use?
Personally, I would use a fish oil supplement if possible, or if someone's plant-based, then I would use something like an algae oil supplement instead.
Yeah, for sure. The only difference I would say, or kind of on that topic, is triple strength. I'd go triple strength fish oil just because research on fish oil is pretty broad. I just think you can move the needle a bit more with higher dosages, and you just wouldn't need to have as many if you use a triple strength one.
Makes sense, yeah. Yeah, the other one that I looked at, that was a randomized control trial, which had a look at DHA supplementation specifically, but it was in an older population, and most of the studies in this area are definitely on the older population, looking at improvements in cognitive decline, mood, that sort of thing. And supplementing with that 900 milligrams a day of DHA, which, to put that into perspective, is a bit more than a triple strength omega-3 fish oil, it does help with memory in that older person age as well, which good to know.
Next one we'll talk about is caffeine, and I don't know, there's so much to talk about here. We obviously know caffeine just in general can help boost motivation and productivity and just focus for a lot of people. There's obviously downsides that come with this. Like some is that it could impact sleep. Some is that it could impact anxiety. You might feel more jittery and it's harder to focus. There's some stuff I'll talk about that too. If I was going to add one, I don't think this is a hot take, but if I was going to add one thing onto this, I think timing matters heaps. And if we're talking about that mid-afternoon crash, something that could be worth contemplating is double dosing caffeine, in terms of if you have a perfect amount for your day, whatever that number is, theoretically you could split it a little bit so you have some at say like 7 or 8 a.m. and then some again at like 11 a.m. where because of the half-life of caffeine you'll still have some in your system in the afternoon crash without it impacting your sleep later in the day, pending the dosage of what you have.
That's a good tip there for sure, because we know that, yes, the half-life of caffeine is long. Ideally, you want to stop having caffeine around the 9 hours before you want to try and go to sleep, given that it does stay in the system for a fairly long time. I would love your thoughts then on the fact that caffeine very much transiently improves performance after intake. So yes, you may still have some in your system. Will it be enough to curb that crash or that slump?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because I still think I would just base on the half-life, right? Because we know that caffeine is interrupting sleep if you're having it too late in the day. And if it's interrupting sleep if you're having it too late in the day, I still think we're still getting some of that benefit from the alertness perspective if it's still in your system, even if it is less. There are even people out there who are having things like, I don't know, a can of Pepsi Max, which is not the equivalent of a coffee. It's obviously noticeably less, who still feel like a bit of a pick-me-up in the afternoon as well.
Yeah. I want to move on to the next one then, which I think we do have a chat about L-theanine, which is an amino acid, and you can find it in green tea as well, but you can also supplement with it. Now, I know this is something you might recommend more often to your clients potentially than I do. So what are your thoughts on that? I'm
massive on L-theanine. So one of the things that got me into this kind of space a fair bit was during university, I just had a friend who was just like into nootropics heaps. And some of the things I look back on now, I was like, why did we do that? That was just dumb. But like one of the things we did was we were using caffeine powder and L-theanine powder. I look back, I was like, why do we use caffeine powder? Like it's so easy to get. Like we lived on campus and we had free access to coffee. Like why did we use caffeine powder? There are dangerous stories of people like accidentally misdosing caffeine powder and accidentally like forgetting to carry a 0 and 10xing the dosage. I don't know, silly. Anyway, but there was heaps of like different nootropic things we were using, and like L-theanine, one of the things that we use and obviously is very well documented is it has a bit of a synergistic effect with caffeine where it offsets a lot of the downsides. So one of the main ones is just like if somebody does feel more jittery, their heart rate increases, they have some feelings of anxiety that are specifically linked to the caffeine. L-theanine can help with those things. It doesn't make people feel drowsier, it just makes people feel less stressed. So it's like you get the benefits of the focus and motivation without any downside. Technically, L-theanine is linked with improved sleep, but I think that's just because most people are a little bit stressed, and helping reduce that will help with sleep as well.
What about supplementing it on its own? Because I had a little bit of a look at a randomized control trial in 2021, and they supplemented, again, middle-aged to older adults, so maybe not completely representative, but they gave them a dose, either a single dose or a 12-week daily dose of about 100 milligrams, of L-theanine. And yes, there was reduced reaction times and enhanced working memory, but no significant changes over the 12-week routine regular intake period. So do you find that this is something that does give those shorter effects? You need to supplement it immediately to have the effect?
It's definitely an acute benefit we'd be looking at, but that's why I talk about it more like alongside caffeine, like offsetting that. Like a lot of supplements in this space will use L-theanine, but that's often just because they're putting it alongside a stimulant. If somebody was struggling to focus because they were stressed or anything like that, I could see benefits, but it's a pretty niche application for that. The other thing on that, though, why I'm so big on it is very safe. A story, I don't think I'll name and shame this person, but like one of my clients who follows like everything I say has one kidney, and out of nowhere one day they just like doubled the dosage of all of their supplements. One of the reasons was they were more stressed than usual. So they're like, oh, anything that helps with stress, I'm just going to double it. So ashwagandha and L-theanine, they just doubled the dosage. And I remember thinking, like, what are you doing? Like, you have one kidney. Like, why have you just doubled the dosage of all your supplements without checking? But I remember looking into it pretty deeply because up until that moment, I'd never needed to, because I was like, 200 milligrams of L-theanine, research clearly shows that this is safe. What about 400? And there's not heaps of human studies on that, but looking at animal research, there's some studies where they have just sent it and given really high dosages of L-theanine to rodents, like high human dosages to rodents that are like much, much smaller, and nothing went wrong. And it got me thinking, being like, even like 400 milligrams in humans is very, very, very likely safe, which makes me even more confident about a dosage of 200 milligrams. You will find some people who report some anecdotal things, like some people will say that it made them feel more tired, even though we don't see that in placebo-controlled research. I have questions there about like, one, is this a perceived thing that they kind of expected to happen? Or two, were they just kind of like really stressed and running on adrenaline, and the moment that was gone, they just felt tired?
Now, there are a few other nootropics that you would like to talk about. And again, I'm just going to give everyone background. This is Aidan's area of expertise. He likes to look into these sort of things. So if we want to have a chat about alpha GPC then, we'll talk about Sue. So we'll do alpha GPC. We're going to talk about tyrosine, rhodiola, rosea, and then also ashwagandha. So as we spoke about off air, like you don't really recommend many of these things. These also aren't frontline recommendations for me either, unless somebody's like really interested in this space. So starting with alpha GPC, one of the reasons why it makes sense is because it provides some of the precursors that help with brain function. We have solid evidence on areas like dementia, but a little bit weaker evidence on just general cognitive enhancement, which is what we're really talking about here. I think it's an easy addition if you want, with minimal downside. It's not one I'm necessarily huge on. Other people are bigger on this. Even when I was talking about the stuff that me and my friend back at university were going through, he was really big on just choline supplementation, which is like what alpha GPC is like a precursor to, because there are other nootropics that can like
deplete choline, because it's like if your brain's working at like overtime, maybe that's depleting choline more as a bit of the logic. Hard to say how much that matters. Tyrosine, so it's another precursor for a lot of neurotransmitters involved in focus, motivation, alertness, and then stress response. In stressful conditions, the evidence is pretty consistent that it helps. Outside of stressful conditions, it's harder to say. Another one that has minimal downside to add in, though, if you want. Rhodiola rosea is another one that has solid evidence for helping improve focus, mood, and motivation when stress is high. Once again, it's hard to say without that. Although I do know a lot of like evidence-based practitioners who, when they make their own supplements in this space, they put it in there. So there's a lot of people who are pretty high on this one. And then ashwagandha is similar logic to L-theanine, albeit slightly more anecdotal experiences of negatives. I started looking into ashwagandha like 6 or 7 years ago because one of my clients asked if they could take it. They weren't like asking me, do you recommend it? They're just like, can I take it? Is it safe? I remember at that time I read every single study that there was out there, because it just turned into a rabbit hole, because the first study I read looked really positive. And then the second looked really positive. Like, okay, I'm just going to keep going. And everything looked really positive. And I realized no one else in the evidence space at that time was really talking about it. It has picked up a bit since then. But I was always wondering, like, why is nobody talking about this? One, I think, is the lack of evidence. There's not like heaps and heaps. The second is some of the research looks a bit too good to be true. I think I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but there's one like bench press study where people gained 42% on their bench press in 8 weeks. And I'm like, that's not happening. But the anecdotal experiences of negatives is more so than L-theanine, where people sometimes report feeling like emotionless or like a zombie or whatever. And although we aren't seeing this show up in research, it's also not like there's so much research out there that I'm going to be like, oh, this definitely doesn't happen, because there's so much anecdotal experiences of that. But once again, if somebody's experiencing heaps of stress, I would consider putting this in, which might make people feel better, more productive, so on and so forth.
What I have found with this sort of category of supplements is the experience that people have is quite individualized, and it is one of those things that you potentially suggest to trial. If it doesn't give the wanted or like the effects that you're hoping that they're going to do, then maybe it's something that you don't continue longer term.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that.
The last one that I think I have on my list in terms of supplements is creatine. And we know that this is a space that's been like more and more researched lately, in the sense that creatine has been shown to have positive effects on memory, attention time, as well as improving processing speed.
I'd say the biggest area that the research has picked up pace on, because it has been looked at for a while, but there's definitely more and more coming out. The biggest area I'd say is cognitive function with higher dosages in periods of high stress / sleep deprivation. And the most interesting thing to me is creatine is typically a chronic supplement where we see benefits as it builds up in your system over time. But one of the biggest changes I would say in terms of how I perceive it is there are acute benefits to creatine and cognitive function. Like, say somebody wakes up sleep deprived one day and then they have 20 grams of creatine, assuming they have no major issues doing that in one go. Within a few hours, the research seems to show that it's helping with all of these things in terms of memory and processing speed, which I think is pretty exciting, because it's just another thing. And it also means, like, if you're sleep deprived, you have another thing you can do that just like makes you feel a little bit better as well.
Which is a good thing. And I think that then brings us to what would we recommend in terms of supplements or dosage there. We know the typical dose is around that 5 grams a day consistently to help with maybe the muscle growth side of things. But it has also been shown to say that 5 grams a day consistently can help with the mental side of things, but more likely that 10 to 20 grams a day is where that benefit lies.
Yeah, and I still think there's a gap there. So I think that one of the reasons why the dosage is higher than 5 grams per day is because it seems like the body is preferentially putting creatine into the muscles rather than the brain. That also goes in both directions. Like this, when you're looking at research on plant-based individuals who are not supplementing creatine, there was a theory that a lot of people had for a long time that people who are plant-based would have lower creatine stores in their brain. And research has just shown that that's not true. Like, they have the same amount of creatine in their brain, which is, it just seems to go in both directions. It's like the last thing that it's pulled from, but also the last thing that it's added to. It just kind of keeps that a bit stable. But if you go higher than that 5 gram dosage, it seems more likely that your body is going to store that creatine in the brain. The gap that I'm referring to is we have this stuff looking at like 20 to 25 gram dosages acutely. What happens if we just took 10 grams every single day? Would we still get those benefits? Hard to say. It's kind of shifted me more towards, like me personally, going higher than a 5-gram dosage on a day-to-day basis. And if I had a random sleep-deprived day or whatever, I would chuck a random 20-gram in there as well. But for me, I have no downsides of having more. Like I don't have gut issues or anything associated with that. And it's just an easy thing for me to do that has no downside.
Yeah, perfect. Is that anything else you wanted to add in terms of supplements?
I don't think so. We could talk like electrolytes.
Yeah, let's have a chat about it.
Do you want to go?
Well, let's start off with just the background. So we know that mild dehydration can affect concentration. It increases your mental effort for tasks, reduces cognitive efficiency, and all of this can translate into that lower productivity. So generally, drinking water boosts attention, memory, and reaction speed, and overall helps reduce fatigue. So we could say then proper hydration is essential to help maintain focus and performance. Where does electrolytes then come into that?
I don't know if we listen to the same type of podcast, but do you hear advertising for electrolytes on podcasts?
Unfortunately, I do
sometimes.
Yeah.
And there's so many that are talking about like replacing coffee with electrolytes for focus and energy. And it's just a bit of an odd one to me because obviously they're just very separate things. But like how dehydrated are you walking around that, I don't know, adding electrolytes like makes a huge difference to this. But let's talk about it. So like if somebody did have an insufficient intake to the point that's leading to like dehydration, adding electrolytes would help. But one of the main ones is obviously sodium. So like if we're talking, I don't want to name brands, but like if we're talking about certain brands, they might have like 1,000 milligrams of sodium. I just think the average person has quite a good sodium intake, maybe more than necessary already. I don't think we necessarily need to be adding more to that beyond specific situations, which there are specific situations. I think most people have enough of an intake of potassium and magnesium to not be dehydrated due to that, although I think people would benefit from adding more of those things. And I think most people just benefit from more water in general. But I think beyond just addressing like an insufficiency, I don't think this is going to help focus or anything more than that.
No, and we've done a different podcast where we speak about how the advertising around electrolytes is quite potentially misleading, making you believe that you do need that to feel hydrated, but often water, and as you mentioned, sodium in the diet is enough. So yeah, if we give a few practical recommendations then, do you want to have a chat about meal timing or frequency?
Yeah, this is actually going to lead back into, there was one last thing I was going to add on, my notes in relation to electrolytes. One exception to what I've just said there is if somebody was specifically using a fasting approach, I'm way more pro electrolytes because you're obviously not getting anything through food because you're not eating food. So that would actually make somebody feel better. But we will go through like mealtime and frequency. So there's obviously heaps of anecdotal reports of like mental clarity with fasting. And I want to start there because there's a bit of an extreme kind of thought experiment being like, okay, if some people report that with fasting, what would that mean if somebody's like constantly grazing across the day? At a minimum, somebody who's fasting doesn't need to stop to eat. So it could help them like with getting into a bit of a flow state and stuff like that with work, and they just don't need to stop. But it is hit and miss. For every person who reports that, there are a bunch of people who report feeling fatigued and having brain fog because they're not eating. So that's another thing. So from a research perspective though, with 16-8 type approaches, so they have the fasting window, but they have an 8-hour eating window, it seems to be neutral to slightly positive for things like alertness and fatigue. Long fasts obviously will have a bit of the opposite impact where people probably do feel more fatigued because there's no food coming in. But there are individual anecdotal reports that will be different. Like there's so many people who are out there who are like, oh, on day 3, I felt incredible. So hard to say. And at the other end of the spectrum, I would say that big meals can cause slumps in productivity and focus. It's like that food coma effect, just on a smaller scale as well. So that would be relevant with/without fasting. Because say somebody was fasting, to eat an appropriate amount of calories for the day or whatever, you have to be having big meals, which would cause that too.
Yes. And aside from the fasting population, if we look at general people then who are eating regularly, if we link it back to that, what we were talking about at the start with stable blood sugar levels, we know that eating every 2 to 3 hours is optimal for this, and having balanced meals with the low GI carbs, protein, fiber, healthy fats, all of those things can really help with maintaining this energy level and potentially also focus there as well. Which can, I guess, when you are working, and especially since this is probably addressed at people who do work, it can be difficult, like setting consistent eating times that frequently.
Yeah, I don't know if you've had this struggle, but I've had this struggle to a degree with athletes with really high calorie needs, like say they're aiming for over 4,000 calories. And then they also care, not like quite biohacking, but they care about productivity and stuff like that. And we do have this thing of it's like we've got to get all of this food in and feel incredible as well.
And where do you do that? And yes, do they have time to stop and have a proper big snack? Or, will it end up being a bigger meal, which maybe isn't optimal either?
Yeah. But yeah, there's not heaps that can really be done with that. Like with those people, I will still be looking at just like spacing it out, as we kind of spoke, like just eating every 2 to 3 hours so that you just don't have any individual case where it's just like a massive meal as well.
Practical tips then, or things that people can take from this. So like we said, biggest barrier is potentially not taking breaks. So I guess that's the first one, being able to take breaks throughout the workday to eat, drink, stopping to have a bite or some water, and workplaces being able to facilitate this as well. Yeah,
the workplaces being able to facilitate this one. When working with clients, I'm always pushing for like, take a lunch break, have your snacks, do all these things. But it's so hard because I'm not there. Like, I don't know exactly what the situation is. I'm always curious being like, because for me, I haven't missed lunch ever. And I know I'm self-employed now, so it makes it a bit easier, but...
We prioritise lunch breaks at Ideal Nutrition.
Yeah. I had a placement experience where my supervisor asked me, do you want to go do this thing or do you want to go and have lunch? And I thought she was serious. And I was like, oh, I do want to go have lunch.
Wrong answer as a student.
Like, marked it down on my end of placement report. And I was like, I didn't realize that was a serious question.
There you go. Well, maybe ways to make that a bit easier are either, discussing that with your employer, making sure that they're okay with that. I guess in general for workplace, that should be a common practice. But ways that you can make that easier for yourself as well is by being prepared and having the food, bringing the food so that when you have time and you've got snacks or either meal prep or food available, you're able to eat it quickly. It's not taking a whole lot of time either. Yeah, that's a big one I was going to add as well. Just like prepping ahead, making sure you've got food prepped so you don't have to waste time like cooking during the day or all those things. Like it's just like prepped in advance. So yeah, that's all I've got on that. Me too. I think that's everything.
Cool. Well, we will wrap up. This was episode 225 of the Ideal Nutrition podcast. As always, if you could please leave a rating and review, that would be greatly appreciated.